We all know that Kevin Young is intent on putting together the best roster he possibly can muster year one of his tenure as BYU basketball head coach. In the current circumstance, what is the best scenario for him and KYU? We're talking about that and also a new quarterback prospect for BYU football.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, a resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of you who are everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. The motto is your team every day, and we are your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business, my friends. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. All right, let's dive right in on today's show and talk some BYU basketball right out the chute. Kevin Young is absolutely getting after on the recruiting trail. I don't think I'm breaking any news to anybody. If you've been paying attention to the headlines, the rumors, the social media posts, whatever way you consume the news out there, is that he is turning over every literal and figurative stone in his effort to put together the best roster he possibly can muster for the BYU basketball program. As it stands, as a recording of this podcast, I'm recording this on Sunday evening, is that BYU currently has 8 guys on the roster for the BYU basketball program. You're allowed 13 scholarships in college basketball, so there's 5 open slots right now for BYU. What does that mean for the Cougars? I'll give you a real quick rundown of how things look for the Cougars right now. Currently, they have Trey Stewart, Richie Saunders, Trevin Nell, Dawson Baker, Dallin Hall, Fousseyni Traore, as well as their 2 most recent additions, Keba Keita and Brody Kozlowski. Those 8, quite a solid crew, I'm not going to lie. I've actually got a lot of intrigue with them. I believe each one of them can play a role on this BYU basketball squad. But the bigger point to be made is you have 5 other slots to elevate this basketball program and keep it on the trajectory it appeared it was on after this past season in the Big 12 Conference. Remember, BYU was a surprise team a year ago. This coming year in the Big 12, they're no longer going to be that. They're going to be one of those teams that people are going to say, you know what? Enough of this feel-good story about BYU. We're going out there, and then we're going to have to absolutely get after them. And I think that BYU is ready for it, because if you look at what BYU is doing on the recruiting trail right now, trying to bring in EuroLeague-type players, high-level NBA draft prospect types via the transfer portal or other recruiting means, it's awesome to see what BYU is doing. But what is the ideal scenario for BYU? Well, the ideal scenario, if I could wave a magic wand and say this is what's going to happen, BYU would garner a commitment from Chaz Lanier, who was on campus yesterday visiting BYU. And the conversations I had with a couple of people about Lanier is that BYU feels very good about where they're at with him. Now, he left Provo and Salt Lake City and immediately headed to Kentucky to meet up with Mark Pope and the Kentucky Wildcats. The other player in this, there's a 3-horse race for Chaz Lanier, is Tennessee. So 2 SEC squads and a Big 12 squad going head-to-head for one of the premier wing players in this transfer portal class. I think Chaz Lanier absolutely be a part of that dream scenario for me. Likewise, Elijah Crawford would be part of the conversation as well. Crawford originally signed with Stanford and then reneged on it, asked for a release from his national letter of intent, has received that, and he will be on campus at BYU Monday. Most will be listening and or watching this on Monday. He's arriving on campus today for a visit. That is a big opportunity for BYU to land 2 potential top-level wing/guard types. Crawford, obviously coming from Brewster Academy in New Hampshire, originally a native of Georgia. He's not the tallest guy in the world, but I mentioned last week on the podcast, he's a 3-level scorer, and his connection with Brandon Dunson, BYU's assistant coach, it's unique. BYU is banking on that connection, maybe being the key deciding factor in getting Crawford to pick BYU in the end. Now, those 2 would be my backcourt tandem that I would add. That'd be 2 of the scholarships eaten up. The next 2 scholarships are 2 guys we've talked about previously on this podcast as well. Those being Berke Buyuktuncel. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. I probably butchered it once again. But the transfer from UCLA is a very, very talented wing player. And if you guys missed the news over the weekend as well, Noah Waterman has officially exited BYU and is committed to play for the Louisville Cardinals. So that leaves a hole in that 4 spot, the wing 4 for BYU. And that's where Berke would slot in very, very nicely, I feel like, for BYU. Now, it also opens an opportunity for Brody Kozlowski coming in as a true freshman to step in there, because that seems like his pretty natural fit for his body type and his skill set. The 4th guy is Maxim Logue, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. It might be Logue. He is a French center prospect, maybe not the most polished player offensively, but just an extreme athlete. He's the type of guy you add to the front court here for BYU. And we have that trio of Fousseyni Traore, Keba Keita, and Maxime Logue, none of them standing 7 foot, mind you. I think the athleticism that those 3 possess may make up for the fact that BYU may play with a little bit shorter lineup. They may not have a true 7-footer on the roster. That's something I've been advocating for months now, quite literally. I thought that BYU needed a legit rim protector as a 6'11" big man, but alas, it may not be that. So that would, if I could wave the magic wand, BYU lands all 4 of those guys. You bring them in, that gets you to 12 scholarships, and then I think that you kind of let things play out. There are those rumors out there, and trust me, a number of you have reached out to me about Igor Demin, the wing player from Russia. I have not heard much, if anything, about him and his connection to BYU. The chatter I've heard from those who have asked me, I've asked them, like, hey, what are you hearing? Apparently, there's a message board from the University of Illinois out there saying that BYU's in the mix for Igor Demin. He is a guy that it's got all kinds of NBA potential in him, 6'8", 190-pound combo guard. And if you can land a guy of that caliber, do it. That'd be a perfect, I think, 13th guy to round out this roster. That's the dream scenario if you're BYU. What's the reality? Of those 5, if you get 2 of them, I think it'd be a pretty nice haul for BYU, because the simple fact of the matter is recruiting is a crapshoot. NIL is involved. How much money can you offer versus how much money is being offered elsewhere? Number 2, what's the institutional fit? Are all these guys going to show up in Provo and immediately fall in love with what BYU's got to offer? TBD. You hope so, but they obviously have to make a decision for themselves. And then the third thing is, how do they feel they fit in with what BYU is going to put on the court? Do they feel like there's a log jam at the position they are hoping to play at BYU? And does that push them to look elsewhere? If I'm a guy like Berke, I'm looking at the fact that Noah Waterman exited the BYU basketball program saying, hey, that's a perfect opportunity for me to step in and start right away. Maybe that's where I end up. I'm looking forward to this. It sounds like there's a lot of good races going on here. I mentioned that Chaz Lanier, it's down to Tennessee and Kentucky. The reports on Berke is it's Nebraska or BYU. So the Cougars are in the mix. I think I'm just going to say, of the 5 players I've mentioned here, if BYU can go 40%, hit 400, as it were, if you want to use the baseball analogy on that, and pick up 2 of the 5, I think it'd be a pretty solid haul. 3 or more, it's a home run. And if you hit all 5, yeah, it's a grand slam, and then something, like a walk-off grand slam to win the World Series. It's a massive, massive opportunity for what Kevin Young is trying to build with this BYU basketball program. I'll reiterate it, that BYU is no longer going to be a surprise team. They're not going to be that 13th out of 14 team in the preseason poll that is that cute underdog that surprises everybody and ends up finishing 5th in the Big 12 Conference a year ago. The Cougars, even with all the changes happening, their coaching staff and the like, they are a marked team now. Teams are not going to screw around with BYU, and for all intents and purposes, they're coming after you. And that is a mark of a good program. Can you put together a roster now, if you're Kevin Young, that can combat that and can go out there and win at the same level, or he may be elevated a little bit more? And that would be a very cool thing if he can do that. The nice part is, I think Kevin Young has got a very, very nice recruiting pitch for every one of these players. Like I said, the institutional fit for most of them, I think BYU is understanding what they're looking for out there with these young men. Number 2, there are openings in that lineup. 3 of BYU's starting 5 players last year, if my math is correct, 3 of the 5, 4 of the 5, with Noah Waterman exiting, have left the program. So there's a number of minutes still to be distributed. Now, BYU played a very deep bench most of the season last year, and that's got to give some hope to some guys maybe currently on the roster, hoping to see an uptick in minutes. But if you bring in the talent that is out there, the BYU's recruiting, and I've only scratched the surface, because I keep hearing that BYU is recruiting more people than they even have let on to publicly. So maybe there is another X factor player out there that BYU is intent on landing, but the current 5 we've talked about here today, you can get all 5 of those. I think it'd be a phenomenal phenomenal roster that BYU would have going into year 2 in the Big 12. All right, coming up here in just a minute, the BYU football program. Now, they obviously are going to year 2 in the Big 12 looking for improvement. A lot of you out there are frustrated with the quarterback position for BYU. Well, there's a young man by the name of Nolan Keeney who recently received an offer from the BYU football program over the weekend that may be the answer to some of y'all's prayers. And we'll talk about that next as we roll on right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find the quality professionals that are right for the role, and that's why you guys need to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. And more importantly, LinkedIn is not just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, simply put, because even those who aren't actively looking for a new job might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. If you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. The best part is also on LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses are getting a qualified candidate within 24 hours of their job posting. Hire professionals like a professional and do it on LinkedIn. Post your job for free today at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Join 2.5 million small businesses who are using LinkedIn for their hiring. And once again, go to linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post that job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of you for being with us. Are you sick of watching Fox Sports or ESPN and hearing all the shouting going on from the talking heads as they quote-unquote embrace debate? Having to turn all that volume down, I want you guys to check it out with our friends over at Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every single day to bring you the biggest news without all the yelling going on the other networks. Locked On Sports Today bring you the can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, my friends. Your team every day. All right, BYU football, Saturday night. Late Saturday night, I was sitting at Rio Tinto Stadium. Actually, no, it's not Rio Tinto Stadium. America First Field, excuse me now. Most of you know in my day job with the KSL Sports Zone, I do pre-half and post-game coverage for Real Salt Lake broadcast for our station. But I was sitting there doing post-game late Saturday night, and all of a sudden, I see it come across the Twitter feed is that pleased to have been offered by BYU, and it's some kid by the name of Nolan Keeney. Now, those of you who are very much in the know who Nolan Keeney is. He's from Tualatin, Oregon. He's a quarterback prospect out of the Oregon area, and he is a guy that BYU has been evaluating and looking at for quite some time. He is a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he is a guy that I think a number of Cougar fans had pinned hopes that BYU's next quarterback prospect would be him. 6'4", 220 pounds by most reports, so he's got the elite size for a quarterback at the high school level. Doesn't have a lot of stats from last year because he dealt with a couple of injuries. I believe one of them was a collarbone injury last year, if I was reading the stories right, and really kind of slow played his development last year, but he's currently got an 84 rating from 24/7 Sports, and that's a mid-tier 3-star prospect. But if you watch what Nolan Keeney can do with the football, this is a kid who's got a very, very nice arm. He's got an ability to be a dual-threat quarterback, albeit, like I said, 6'4", 220. He's got the size that you covet at the quarterback position. He's not, and I love McKay Hillstead, but McKay Hillstead is 5'10", 190 pounds soaking wet. Nolan Keeney, how big could this guy get at 6'4", 220 right now as going into his high school senior season? That's the thing about this is an elite size quarterback prospect that BYU has offered. I know Aaron Roderick has been meticulous in going about offering his quarterback situation and making sure that he finds the right guys. Also, the simple fact of the matter is BYU's got a loaded quarterback room right now. And I mean loaded, not in the sense that maybe it has elite talent in it top to bottom. It's just there are a ton of dudes in that room. And that's going to cramp a little bit, I think, what BYU is trying to do here at their quarterback position. Now, they would love to have Nolan Keeney, obviously, because of them offering him indicates that BYU sees value and they expect that he can come in and compete for the Cougars. But I think if BYU strikes out on Nolan Keeney, I think BYU may stand pat and just not take a quarterback in this recruiting cycle. I know it sounds crazy to say because Aaron Roderick's own words have been that he wants to always take a quarterback in every recruiting cycle, but at the same time, with the transfer portal, BYU added McKay Hillstead to the mix, and he's got 3 years of eligibility beyond this season. That's the simple fact of the matter is that maybe McKay Hillstead is the guy that BYU has maybe pinned their hopes on for the future of this quarterback position, and maybe he is taking up that slot. Like I said, if you offer Nolan Keeney, that means you are willing to take him. But if you don't, for whatever reason, end up garnering his commitment, speaking of Keeney, maybe you stand pat and just let things ride with how they are. Is that going to make some of you Cougar fans upset? I can guarantee you are. I'm sure you're probably already writing up your comments right now on YouTube, or sending them to me via social media or DM, however you want to contact the show. We're available on social media platforms across the board. I welcome your feedback. But that's my gut feeling on this, because if you've been paying attention to how BYU's gone about recruiting quarterbacks of late, they've offered a few guys, but they haven't been necessarily in the mix with every quarterback that is out there, seemingly like they have in other recruiting cycles. That indicates to me that A, either they are completely maxed out on scholarships, or B, they're content with where things stand right now for BYU at quarterback. I think the Cougars, and this is just the way that I'm perceiving things, because a lot of change has not taken place with the transfer portal this season. I think BYU is betting on continuity. They're kind of betting on what Mark Pope and the BYU basketball program did in their transition from the West Coast Conference to the Big 12. Remember, that same roster, by and large, like 90% of it, was a program that finished fifth in the West Coast Conference and was a team that most Cougar fans were like, you know what, this is never going to get it done in the Big 12. Mark Pope better be looking for a new job before. There was a lot of angst about the BYU basketball program. Mark Pope bets on continuity, says, I'm sticking with my guys. We're going to work on skill development and play together as a team. And what do? They go out and finish fifth in the Big 12 conference, but he gets a single-digit seed in the NCAA tournament. My outside perspective, and let me be very clear about this, this is just me talking about BYU football, is I look at BYU essentially betting on a similar type scenario happening for them year two in the Big 12 here. That's why I don't think you saw wholesale changes for BYU in the transfer portal. They brought in more than half of their roster via different means last year, and last year was a highly disappointing season, finishing 5-7, I think, all things considered. So I look at this, and yes, Nolan Keeney, I think, is a fantastic prospect. I look at it and I say, this is a kid, absolutely, you take him. If he is interested in going to BYU, you absolutely bring him in. He's got offers from Houston, a Big 12 compatriot and rival of BYU's. Boise State's also in the mix with this young man. And he's done all this, got a lot of this interest, despite, like I said, missing a large portion of his junior season last year. So I think that the Cougars are looking at this saying, you know what, we're going to look at all options, but we're going to be very judicious in who we go about offering here. And we're essentially going to bet our bet that if we work on what we have in the program right now and develop that, that's probably our better chance to win at a high level going forward. It's the whole old adage we hear in basketball and football: get old and stay old. You have to do that, obviously, via recruiting means. That transfer portal can be a help with that. Just banking on your young players developing over time and hoping that they don't run off via the transfer portal. That's a way to get old. But I think the Cougars right now are banking on the fact of continued development will yield the results that they want this fall. Ultimately, will it come to fruition? Maybe so. And maybe Nolan Keeney is the truth at quarterback. They bring him in. He comes in, lights the world on fire, shows off a very, very nice arm, by the way, on his social media feeds. If you go and look at his huddle highlights, he shows a very, very live arm. And like I said, at 6'4", 220, that's an absolute battering ram as a dual threat quarterback. That's not a guy you're not necessarily as worried about taking a hit and not being able to absorb it. That's a very, very nice sized athlete that you can add to the stable for BYU at quarterback. So I would love for BYU to land Nolan Keeney, but I really do think if they don't get him, that may be the last offer for BYU in this quarterback class. I just kind of crazy to consider, but I just kind of reading the tea leaves right now for BYU football. I just don't see Aaron Roderick trying to bust down the door of every other quarterback out there in the 2025 class saying, please, please, please come play for BYU. I just don't see that happening. I think he is banking on the fact that Jake Retzloff, wins the job this year and becomes the quarterback they hoped he was and is the guy for the next 2 years. And then beyond that, whether it's Nolan Keeney, McKay Hillstead, whoever else is in the mix at quarterback for BYU at that point, then they can kind of pick up the torch and carry it forward for the BYU basketball program. Last year was disappointing, but I do think that BYU has capability of being a far more competitive team this fall. And the hope is that bet on continuity pays off in dividends, because if it doesn't, that's when heads figuratively will roll for BYU, and we'll see what happens going forward with the Cougars. But yeah, really like the offer to Nolan Keeney. I think that his connection to BYU, being a member of the LDS faith, obviously very, very nice just statistics, even though he's had that injury during his junior season. I look at this and say, this is a really, really savvy pickup if BYU can manage it. And by the way, even if it doesn't work out for Nolan Keeney at quarterback, you can do a lot with a guy who's 6'4", 220 pounds. You can move him to a number of different positions. Linebacker, you bulk him up playing at defensive end, maybe move him to tight end on offense. The capabilities are endless. Guys of his size, his athleticism, just his ilk, that's absolutely something you want in your football program, and we'll see how it shakes out for the Cougars. But I think this is a very, very nice offer for BYU, and I'm fingers crossed that BYU can land this kid because I think he's got a lot of talent, and I think he's got a lot to offer to the BYU football program. All right, we will wrap up today's show coming up next with a couple of thoughts on BYU baseball. They wrapped up their season over the weekend at Kansas State. How did things go there? And we'll also cover a couple other topics we haven't had a chance to touch on quite yet on today's show as we roll on right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL playoffs, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. If you've not been thrilled by what's going on with the NHL or NBA playoffs, I don't know what to tell you. I've been absolutely enthralled by both of them. The best part is, even if it's not your cup of tea, you got baseball out there. You got futures odds for BYU football. If you think that 4.5 over-under win total is complete bunk, well, guess what? Go put some money on it. The best part is right now, new customers, you get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Think about that. It's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. And it's all in an app that's super easy and fun to use, my friends. So visit FanDuel.com/lock to make every playoff shot count. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/locked-on to make your playoff shot count. Get $150 off your $5 deal. It's all courtesy of your friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first to listen to the day. If you've not signed up already, please join our Locked On Cougars Insider Group. There's a link in the show notes, whether you're watching and or listening to this. It's a great way to interact with the show. I'm sending updates out, and the best part is it comes to your phone in the form of a text message. You fire back with a text message, I see it right away in my feed as well. Love interacting with y'all and appreciate all the support you guys have given us so far. And anything I'm hearing about BYU sports when I'm not recording this podcast, it's going to our Locked On Cougars Insider Group. So click the link in the show notes below once again. Join us there. 14-day free trial, $4.99 a month afterwards. And it supports the show and also gets you that inside intel you won't find anywhere else. All right. A couple of notes about BYU football before we go here. We mentioned that BYU's offered Nolan Keeney. Well, there's been a new tight end prospect that has emerged on the scene for BYU. And I didn't have this on my radar, so maybe I'm out of the loop on this. But Jayden Savoury, which, by the way, an incredible last name. Jayden Savoury, 6'6", 220-pound tight end prospect out of Orchard Lake, Michigan. He goes to St. Mary's High School out there in Michigan. He is slated an official visit to BYU on June 17th. He's a high 3-star talent, according to 24/7 Sports, an 87 rating. The composite rating has him just a shade under that, 86.52, so 86.52. So I think this is a very interesting prospect here. I don't know of any direct connections between Savoury and BYU, but he's already set an official visit. There have been a few that BYU has set. And by the way, Aaron Dunn officially visited BYU over this past weekend, the high-level 4-star talented offensive tackle from Spanish Fork. He made that visit over the weekend to BYU, but the Cougars are setting up a number of official visits, and it's no longer the little engine that could when it comes to BYU and recruiting guys. The Cougars are operating like a Big 12 program. They're bringing in high-level prospects like a Jayden Savoury and saying, come and check out what we've got here. We are a Big 12 program. We're part of the big time. Come be a part of it here for us. Reading up on him, the story from 24/7 Sports, it said that he is banking on BYU becoming a very solid Big 12 program and the tight end position being a big part of it. His background a little bit more in basketball at 6'6", 220 pounds, but man, his athletic profile, speaking of Savoury, I really, really am intrigued with it, and we'll see how it goes when BYU gets him out here on a visit on June 17th. But keep it locked here on the podcast. We're going to be tracking a number of these official visits because they're going to come hot and heavy here starting very, very soon. And we'll be having updates for you guys along the way as we get to that. By the way, tomorrow on the podcast, scheduled to talk with Austin Leusa, the BYU offensive lineman, the transfer from Southern Utah. He is anticipated to join me on tomorrow's podcast. A little bit of a tease ahead on that for you guys if you're looking ahead to our Tuesday edition of the show. All right. couple of notes before we go on today's show is the BYU baseball season is over. They finished it off in pretty good fashion, all things considered. They finished their inaugural Big 12 season on a high note with Parker Goff delivering a game-winning grand slam as BYU beat Kansas State 12-8 in 10 innings Saturday afternoon at Twington Family Stadium out there in Manhattan, Kansas. It was a really, I'd say, disjointed season for BYU baseball. There's some very high moments, and obviously you have a grand slam that wins your regular season finale for you if you're BYU baseball. You celebrate that, but the simple fact of the matter is BYU finished 21-31 overall, so well under 500, a .404 a winning percentage. Even worse, 7-23 in the Big 12 Conference. So just a brutal debut in the Big 12 Conference. What's it going to take for BYU baseball to get back to being a competitive program? Because I don't know that BYU has what it takes right now to compete in the Big 12 in baseball. Just looking on its head at how things went for the Cougars this season, just the pitching never held up to any significant degree. The offense at times, Kuhio Aloy was an incredible find out of Maui, out there in the islands of Hawaii. I think he's a big bat that BYU's lucky to have, but what's to say that he doesn't look elsewhere if he feels like BYU is going to hold him back from his ultimate dream? He said it's very clear that he wants to be a guy who plays in the show in Major League Baseball, and he's got a big bat that I'm sure other Big 12 programs probably saw him across the field and said, hey, let's offer that kid some NIL money and see if we can get him to transfer. That's the situation I'm looking at with BYU baseball. I just don't know what it's going to take for the Cougars to compete at the Big 12 level without investing more heavily than they have in BYU baseball. They've got an incredible venue. Miller Park, it's unlike many venues in the entire country. The backdrop with the Wasatch Mountains right there is just incredible. I have so many guys I talk to around the Big 12 who see pictures of Miller Park and say, Jake, is that legit? I'm like, it's absolutely 100% legit. That is what you see when you sit there in the grandstands at Miller Park. It's an incredible backdrop. The problem is the play on the field, it pales in comparison to that majesty you get to watch beyond it. So I don't know what it's going to take, but BYU's got to find some answers, and we'll see what happens going forward here. I'm expecting some changeover in the roster, obviously, for BYU baseball. It's just inevitable, but I think Trent Prett, he's got to deliver something pretty quick here, and that's the problem is you have stepped up in competition to an even higher level, and you were a decent program in the West Coast Conference, but you were not world beaters by any means in the West Coast Conference, and so now it's just the intensity level, the overall, I'm trying to say the overall pressure, I guess, on you has been ratcheted up. And can you deliver? That's the big question. We'll see what happens for BYU baseball going forward, but it's going to take some work, I think, for BYU to get back over the hump. So we all knew there was going to be a challenge. Just to be very clear about this, about BYU baseball, but 7-23 in the Big 12. That's not a good mark. I expected better than that. Better than 233 on the win percentage, I think, overall for BYU in the Big 12. That ain't it. So they gotta figure something out here. All right, so there you go. That's what I got for you guys on this Monday edition of the show. A big thank you to all of you for your support of the podcast, as always. Hope you guys are all doing well out there. Once again, please continue to share, rate, review. Make sure people know about this podcast if you don't mind. Let your friends and family know that, hey, this is a daily product. It's free. And the best part is it's available wherever you get your podcasts. It's also available on YouTube. So I appreciate, once again, all the support you guys give this show, and appreciate all of you for tuning in every single day. We like to call you guys our everydayers. And a big thank you, as always, once again, for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And once again, thank you for being everydayers right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.